I would like to introduce our two speakers. First, we have Sarah Hasenack, and we also have Ann Bell, both with Ontario Nature's Protected Places team. And they're going to give you this presentation on wetland conservation resources for community groups. So take it away, guys.
Great. Thank you, Leslie. And yeah, thanks to everyone who's here for taking time out of your evening to come and learn about our new wetland resources. Can you move to the next slide? Thank you. So I'm going to open the session tonight with an acknowledgement and brief history of the land where I'm situated, which is now known as the City of Waterloo. And of course, this is always an important way to open our meetings, but I really want to emphasize its importance today because this week is the Treaties Recognition Week in Ontario, which has been recognized on the first full week of November each year since 2016. And as we all know, Indigenous peoples have inhabited and cared for the lands of Turtle Island since time immemorial. So the Attawandaron people were among the earliest known inhabitants of the area now known as Waterloo, but unfortunately by the end of the 1600s, their once thriving populations had been greatly diminished due to famine, diseases brought by European settlers, and various conflicts, and those who remained integrated into Haudenosaunee and other Indigenous nations. Diverse Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations have also long inhabited this area. Despite having a strained relationship at times, these groups have shared the land respectfully since the early 1700s when they adopted the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant. And this covenant establishes an agreement extending to all inhabitants of the land to peacefully share the land or the dish by taking only what we need, being sure to keep the dish clean, and always leaving enough for others, including future generations. Waterloo is also part of the Between the Lakes Treaty and Haldimand Treaty agreements between Indigenous nations and European settlers. In 1784, Mississauga chiefs signed the Between the Lakes Treaty, which would transfer their rights to the lands between Lakes Ontario, Erie, and Huron to the British for only £1,180, equivalent to about 366,000 Canadian dollars by today's standards. And of course, there were significant cultural differences around the concept and understanding of land ownership and what this transfer would entail in terms of the British settlers' intentions for the land. Later that year, the Haldimand Treaty granted Haudenosaunee people, also known as the Six Nations, a tract of land spanning 10 kilometers on either side of the Grand River from its source in Dufferin County to its outlet in Lake Erie, of course including the area where it passes through what is now Waterloo. The implications of this treaty regarding who held the rights to sell the land have been extensively disputed over the years, and really complicated situation, which has led to centuries of complex land rights claims along the river, including in Waterloo. Today, the only remaining Indigenous held land in the original Haldimand Treaty area is the Six Nations of the Grand River Reserve near Brantford, representing less than 5% of the original tract of land that they were given. These nations continue to investigate the land transfers that occurred in the Haldimand Treaty area and to seek fair compensation for the losses that they had. Now, this is, of course, only a high-level overview of the history here, but I've chosen to share this today to acknowledge the complex and rich history that has led up to what are still complex and rich experiences of the diverse Indigenous people who live in this area and across Turtle Island today. We are all treaty peoples, and I acknowledge my responsibility to continue to learn the history of the land that I call home, to respect and care for the land and all its inhabitants, and to do my part to advance truth and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, the original stewards and caretakers of Turtle Island. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Sarah. I just want to say someone has their hand raised, and I just want to remind people if you have any questions or challenges to maybe just put those in the chat or the Q&A, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. And I hope that whoever has their hand up gets their situation sorted out. Okay, yeah, great. So I also just wanted to take a moment to give a huge thank you to the funders of Ontario Nature's Wetlands campaign, the Greenbelt Foundation, who funded the creation of our wetlands as nature-based climate solutions resources, which we'll be talking about today, as well as the John and Pat McCutcheon Charitable Foundation, the K.M. Hunter Charitable Foundation, and the McLean Foundation. We couldn't do the work that we do, including providing this webinar, without the generosity of these organizations, and we're truly grateful for their support. Next slide, please. Perfect. Now I just want to give a quick overview of what to expect from the presentation. So we'll start with Anne giving a quick introduction to the status of wetlands in Ontario to set the context for our new resources, which we'll spend most of our time talking about. Then Anne will introduce two of our new resources, which are about the wetlands as nature-based climate solutions, before taking a quick 5-minute pause for any questions that have come up. And then I'll take things over again to introduce our third new resource, which is a report about wetland offsetting policy, before wrapping things up and spending our remaining time to answer any other questions that have come up. With that, I will pass things over to Anne for a little bit.
This is where there's been a loss of greater than 85% of wetlands. You know, sadly, these losses are continuing despite policies that we have in place that are supposed to protect them. And the main drivers of loss are listed here on the slide: development and land conversion, climate change, invasive species, pollution, and drainage and alder hydrology. Next slide, please. So in 2017, I don't know if anybody can remember, there was extensive public consultation by the Government of Ontario about a new wetland conservation strategy for Ontario, and it was supposed to last from 2017 to 2030, I believe. Anyway, it set some pretty ambitious objectives about halting wetland loss by 2025, and then achieving a net gain in wetland area and function by 2030. But then a new government was elected and the wetland conservation strategy was shelved, didn't go anywhere. And what we've witnessed since then is an endless stream of environmental deregulation, with many of the new laws and policies undermining wetland protections. We saw the weakening of Conservation Authority powers in 2020 with Bill 229, and then again last year with Bill 23. We've witnessed the unleashing of ministers' zoning orders, known as MZOs, which now number over 100 in Ontario. These MZOs override provincial policies and public participation requirements, and they cannot be appealed. The Ontario Wetland Evaluation System, and this is perhaps one of the most troubling things, the Wetland Evaluation System has been gutted, and consequently, we're likely to see very few wetlands designated as provincially significant in the future. And many of those that currently have that status are likely to lose it. And with that, they will lose the protection that provincially significant status affords. The government is planning also to get rid of the growth plan for the Great and Golden Horseshoe, and with it, the restraints that it places on development, as well as the protections that it affords to wetlands and other natural heritage features. The government has said that it plans to introduce a provincial natural heritage offsetting policy, which will of course apply to wetlands. Sarah will go into the risks that offsetting entails in her slides coming up. On the bright side, the government is reversing its greenbelt land removals, many of which impacted wetlands. Minister Calandra has also said that he'll be reversing the forced municipal boundary expansions. But we learned last Friday that apparently at the same time he's also inviting the mayors of single and lower tier municipalities to proceed with the boundary expansions without council approval or public consultation. Next slide, please. All of which is to say, wetlands need you. They need community members to keep watch, speak up, and push back when necessary. If that's a role you're interested in playing, Ontario Nature is here to help. If that's what our wetland resources are for. Next slide, please. Our resources include a report on wetland offsetting policies and a primer and a brochure about wetlands, wetland conservation, and wetland restoration as nature-based climate solutions. Our purpose in creating these resources was to ensure that nature advocates like you had information at hand to respond to the law and policy changes that are occurring. We suspect that many of you may be involved in efforts to protect local wetlands or to respond to local wetland policy initiatives, and we hope that these resources can help. They provide the information and the arguments that you may need to make the case for wetland protection from a climate change perspective. I'll focus my remarks specifically on the primer and the brochure, and Sarah will address the offsetting report. Next slide, please. The online primer is composed of 5 web pages, which summarize the benefits that wetlands provide in terms of carbon storage and sequestration, reducing flood risk, and helping wildlife to adapt to climate change. It provides many links to additional resources, including several studies, so that you have easy access to information if you'd like to take a deeper dive. You'll find information on everything from the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands to the role of wetlands for Ontario's native bees. Our brochure is a 6-page summary of the key information that's presented in the primer. It was designed in partnership with our Youth Council, with the Ontario Nature Youth Council members, and they help to ensure that it's nice to look at, easy to read, and easy to share. In fact, that's the beauty of all of these resources. They can easily be shared in an email by simply copying the link. Next slide, please. As noted in the primer, wetlands are carbon storage superstars. The primer explains briefly how wetlands capture carbon, the incredible amount that they store, with specific estimates for Ontario, and the danger of disturbing wetlands in terms of carbon release. It also highlights the importance of wetland restoration from a carbon perspective. Both the primer and the brochure describe the vital role that wetlands play in mitigating flooding. The primer also outlines other climate adaptation benefits that wetlands provide in terms of reduced erosion, reduced drought intensity, improved water quality, and the local cooling effect. In terms of biodiversity benefits, our resources focus on the provision of habitat for wildlife. The primer features 2 specific wetlands as examples: Rattray Marsh in southern Ontario and the Nabish wetlands in northwestern Ontario. Next slide, please. Here's one of the facts behind our claim that wetlands are carbon storage superstars. It is estimated that Ontario's wetlands may contain over 29 billion tons of carbon. And that's the carbon equivalent of taking every one of Canada's 24.1 million gas-powered vehicles off the road for 1,000 years. Much of this carbon is stored in the boreal peatlands of northern Ontario. Next slide. And here's another fun fact. A study commissioned by Ontario's Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry in 2017 found that maintaining wetlands can reduce flood damages and costs by 29% in rural areas and up to 38% in urban areas. So that is a significant economic benefit. And it was noted in the 2019 report of Ontario's Special Advisor on Flooding. Next slide. And in terms of the importance of wetlands for biodiversity, it may come as no surprise to you that at least 20% of Ontario's species at risk rely on wetlands for food and habitat. After all, wetlands are among the most productive and biodiverse ecosystems on Earth. If species are going to be able to adapt to climate change impacts, they're going to need options such as refuges and natural corridors for movement. Next slide. We hope that you will be able to use our primer and brochure to help raise awareness of the many benefits that wetlands provide and to inform local decision-making. We all need to understand what is at stake. If decision makers aren't moved by the ecological arguments, perhaps they'll at least find the economic arguments persuasive. If so, I'll close with another fact for you. According to a study commissioned again by the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, the benefits provided by wetlands in southern Ontario alone are estimated to be worth more than $51 billion per year. Okay, thanks for listening. And now I think we're going to pass on to an opportunity to ask any questions, if you have any so far.
Yes, hi everyone. Thanks for that background, Anne. So again, if you have any questions, please go ahead and type them in the Q&A. We do have a smaller group tonight, so if you want to ask a question verbally, then you can raise your hand and I can allow you to speak. I'll just let you know that that means that you will appear on the recording. So either way, either raise your hand or type it in the Q&A. We do have one question, and do we have a map of wetland loss in Northern Ontario?
I'm not aware of us having such a thing, Leslie.
Any
I
idea?
don't know that I've seen one either. Have you, Sarah?
No, I haven't come across one either, and that certainly represents a big gap in information if there isn't any studies so far into wetland loss there. It's a big part of our province, so.
For sure. Okay, well, something to keep an eye out for sure. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions right now, so I guess we'll go on with the presentation, but just a reminder, everybody, if you do have questions as we go along, then please do type them in the Q&A. Oh, I got one more comment that we'll squeeze in here before we move along. So I guess related to the first one, do you think there should be different rules for Northern Ontario?
That is such a good question. I don't know if anybody's aware of the study that just came out, put out by the Northern Policy Institute. Anyway, we're going to be responding to that study in a blog next week, so you might want to watch that. But I think, and Sarah, you're more familiar with it than I am, but I think their basic argument is absolutely need different rules in Northern Ontario. But, you know, I think we need to ask ourselves questions about that. Do we want to see Northern Ontario lose wetlands to the extent that we've lost them in Southern Ontario? Like, do we want the North to go down the same path as in the South? I'm not from Northern Ontario, and I think perhaps somebody from Northern Ontario could have a better answer to that question. You know, different geographies, different stressors, and so on. I would say bottom line is we need to take care of our wetlands wherever they are in the province. And there might be different approaches, there might be different policies that are appropriate. But, you know, in lots of cases, the wetlands cannot be replaced. And Sarah's going to get into that a little bit more when she talks about offsetting. Sarah, did you have anything you wanted to add to my ramble?
No, I think that was a good answer, Anne. And it is a complicated situation, especially like also myself not being from Northern Ontario and not having that deep familiarity with every like the differences in terms of what Northern Ontario experiences compared to Southern Ontario. But I think we can all safely agree here that we want to see wetlands protected, and what form that takes might need to be different. It might be appropriate for it to be different, but certainly that they need to be protected. So
I just see Ron Prickett's comment there about the article. Yeah, littered with inaccuracies. That's exactly it. It's very frustrating to see something put out by a policy institute that is just full of inaccuracies. So that's what we're going to be addressing in our blog next week. The other question, with the loss of conservation authority influence, what role do municipalities have? Where does their expertise come from? That is a really big problem. And that's why we mentioned the conservation authority situation in our list of damaging policies that have come forward, because conservation authorities have provided that expertise. And now, where will municipalities get that kind of information and insight? Where will they get the monitoring? How is that going to happen? It is a big problem with the weakening of conservation authority powers in Ontario. I mean, will municipalities be able to pick it up? Will they be able to do that monitoring? Do they have that expertise? That's the problem.
Big time. Yeah, thanks for that, Anne and Sarah. Okay, so we'll move on to the next section. And again, do keep typing your questions as they come up. So I'll let you guys take it away.
if you could Yeah, there we go. Perfect. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for all those questions. That was great. Great little break in the middle of us talking a bunch. And thank you, Leslie, for helping moderate that. And Anne, of course, for your great introduction to our nature-based climate solutions resources and answering all those questions as well. But yeah, I'm going to switch gears now for the second half of the presentation and talk a bit about the third new resource, which is that report all about wetland offsetting and the wise policy practices required in order to navigate this extremely risky practice. Next slide, please. But first, what is wetland offsetting? So not super sure how familiar everyone on the call is with this practice, but at its core, offsetting involves a trade-off where conservation actions are taken to compensate for the adverse effects of development. Basically, a development proponent would be permitted to remove a wetland from the landscape under the condition that they create, restore, or enhance wetland ecosystems elsewhere. Sometimes, but not always, of equal or greater size and value. It's often premised on the goal of achieving no net loss or ideally a net gain in wetland area and function, but in fact, these goals are rarely ever achieved. Thus, offsetting is sorry, Leslie. Thank you. Thus, offsetting is a conservation or controversial, my goodness, and extremely risky practice, and it offers certain loss for uncertain gain. Next slide. Thank you. So despite the risks, offsetting for wetlands and other ecosystems is gaining traction. In 2021, 24 out of the 26 municipalities and conservation authorities surveyed by the Greenbelt Foundation participated in offsetting, and 15 of them noted that the number of offsetting files that they were receiving seemed to be increasing. In our own review of municipal official plans in the Greater Golden Horseshoe, we also found that about 75% of those plans had policies requiring some form of compensation for the damages caused by development, whether that be a full kind of wetland or ecosystem offset or a tree replacement compensation. Covered the whole gambit, but it's quite prevalent. Next slide, please. And then what's more, late last year, in the flurry of policy action that we saw in the fall, the Government of Ontario also posted a proposal on the Environmental Registry of Ontario about developing a natural heritage offsetting policy. So this was just the initial discussion paper, not the policy itself, and it did include some somewhat promising elements, such as that net gain goal and an avoidance first approach, which I'll talk a bit more about in a moment. However, given the other law and policy changes that have gone forward since that time, many of which Anne touched on at the beginning of the presentation, we certainly have reason to be concerned about what lies ahead with this policy. So all of us really need to be prepared to respond if and when this provincial policy comes forward. Next slide. And that, of course, is what our new report is all about, being prepared. So the report was co-written by myself and a municipal planning and policy expert named Michael Winia. It's informed by an extensive scientific and policy research, and we circulated it also for review by a handful of experts, including Michael Winia as our planning and policy expert and 2 Indigenous colleagues for their input as well. And the feedback that we received from this review process really helped to improve the report. And as you've likely gathered already, Michael's contributions during the review process were so significant that we invited him to join us as a co-author. The PDF for the report is also available online at ontarionature.org/wetlands under the What Are We Doing section. And we'll be circulating a link to the report as well as the nature-based climate solutions resources in the email follow-up with the recording of the webinar in the next couple of days. Next slide. Perfect. So to give a little preview of what you could expect from the report, if you were to read it, it basically encompasses 3 main sections. We start with an introduction to what offsetting is, its growing popularity, and the risks involved. Similar to what I've just briefly introduced, though the report itself goes into a lot more detail, especially about all the research that's shown the risks involved. We then provide a framework of 10 criteria for effective offsetting policy based on significant points of agreement among industry experts. These criteria are intended to provide a framework by which you could draft or evaluate an offsetting policy or provide comments on an offsetting policy to try to create the best possible outcomes for nature. And then the bulk of the report, is used to highlight real examples of offsetting policies from municipalities and conservation authorities in Ontario, showcasing where they're doing really well to achieve the 10 criteria that we lay out, and also an analysis of what makes each example strong. For each of the criteria, we've also provided draft policy wording that we feel meets the criterion fairly well. Many thanks to the contributions of Michael Vinia. Next slide, please. Thank you. So now that I've kind of introduced what the report is all about, we thought it would be good to cover some of the key elements to give a little more flavor of what's in there. So first I have the 10 criteria laid out on this slide and the next one, and I'll give a quick summary of those. So the first one is a commitment to achieving a net gain. We want to make sure that if we're going down this road with offsetting and given all the risks involved, it's not just about mitigating harm or even achieving a no net loss. Maintaining the status quo, especially in Southern Ontario where there's been such extensive losses, is simply not sufficient. We need to reverse this historical and ongoing loss of wetlands in Ontario. The second one is consideration of diverse wetland values. So achieving that net gain goal should be premised not only in terms of wetland area, but also in terms of other ecological, cultural, social, and economic values that need to be accounted for. Third, offsetting should be premised on respectful engagement with Indigenous communities based on free, prior, and informed consent. Fourth, offsetting must always be treated as a last resort. So that's after avoiding, minimizing, and mitigating harmful impacts to the greatest extent possible. This is known as the mitigation sequence, and it's been embraced by experts everywhere. The trouble is, it's rarely successfully implemented, and those first steps before offsetting have a tendency to get maybe glazed over more than they should. So there needs to really be some strong policy wording to make sure that the sequence is upheld. And fifth, the last one on this slide, limits to which ecosystems can be considered for offsetting. This criterion acknowledges that offsetting is simply not suitable for certain types of wetlands or circumstances. The term often used in the literature is irreplaceable. Bogs and fens, for example, are irreplaceable because we simply can't replace them in any meaningful timescale. They take hundreds to thousands of years to develop, so once they're lost, they're pretty well lost for the foreseeable future. Provincially significant wetlands are also irreplaceable because they are known to have features and qualities that are simply too valuable to lose. Next slide, please. Strategic offset site selection is number 6. So finding an appropriate site to locate an offset close to that original lost or impacted ecosystem is one of the key challenges with this practice, especially in areas that are already heavily developed and don't have a lot of green space available. So if land use planners are going to go down this road, we need to make sure that there's a process in place to identify a suitable place to locate the offset before that damage is done. Reduction of time lags and provision of long-term protections for offset is the 7th. So policies should consider and minimize those temporal losses or time lags. So that's the time between when that natural wetland is lost or damaged and when the offsetting project is sufficiently well established that it's able to provide some similar values. It's also important to ensure that the wetland offset is protected for the long term once it's established. And protections for the newer restored wetland as part of the offset should last at least as long as the negative impacts to the natural ecosystem, but ideally they should be protected permanently. And that's to prevent the situation where you lose a wetland and you replace it somewhere else, and then you lose the replacement and replace it somewhere else, and it just ends up shifting loss around the landscape. That's not what we want to see happen. So then we need to have the protections. Number 8 is monitoring of offset performance. So policies should require that monitoring occurs regularly and for enough time that the offsetting project, or to ensure, that the offset project is successful. And where that monitoring might reveal that the desired outcomes aren't being achieved, there need to be steps taken to address those shortcomings and make sure that success is achieved. Number 9, offsetting policies should set out specific ways of measuring gains and losses of the identified values in order to ensure that enough of the gains are being realized in the offset to make up for the accepted losses where the wetland was damaged. So these ways of measuring gains and losses need to be carefully selected to ensure that they're relevant measures of what we're interested in replacing, and they should also be kept as consistent as possible. And finally, transparency reporting. Policies should ensure that there's a regular reporting of offset outcomes and that those findings are available to the public, as that's such an important component of trust and accountability. Next slide. Now, I know I was through those pretty quickly and kept it at a pretty high level, but if you want more detailed explanations of the criteria and their rationale, you can see our online primer about wetland offsetting or pages 7 to 8 of the report. And of course, please continue to add any questions you might have to the Q&A feature for us to answer at the end. But for now, I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the key strengths and policy gaps that we found as we were doing our kind of policy research for each of the criterion. Perfect. Thank you, Leslie. So starting on the positive side, as we like to do, we found that there were examples of strong policies that already exist among Ontario's municipalities and conservation authorities for many of the criteria. Most notably, we found a good handful of strong examples where local authorities are committing to that principle of net gain. They're adhering to the mitigation sequence, establishing limits to what can be offset, and setting up strategic site selection processes. So the report presents several examples with the specific policy wording where local authorities have established those strong policies that uphold these criteria. And these examples could be really helpful for other local authorities who are working on or considering their own offsetting policies so they can know what's been done well and then continue to adopt or build upon that existing good work. Next slide. And then, of course, on the flip side, our policy research also identified some notable gaps where there are very few, if any, strong policies that exist in Ontario at this point. And this isn't just limited to Ontario, though that was where our policy research is kind of scoped to for the report. These are kind of gaps that we notice if you look elsewhere as well. And what we found is that there are some notable gaps in the inclusion of social and cultural values in those policy goals, requirements and guidelines for meaningful and respectful engagement with Indigenous communities, the consideration of Indigenous cultural values when setting limits to offsetting, relevant indicators and methods by which to quantify those gains and losses, and then requirements for public transparency and reporting. Now, that's not to say that there aren't good intentions. Yeah, thank you. Not to say that there aren't good intentions among those who are practicing wetland offsetting to this point, and maybe there are places where some of these things are happening despite not being written into the policy. However, these are areas where the policy wording is lacking, and that leaves the door open to lower the bar, which is a bit of a dangerous situation when we have such a risky practice. So for those areas where we didn't find strong existing policies, we really hope that the draft policies we provided in the report, with plenty of support from Michael Winya, will be especially useful in helping to navigate these gaps and better address them in the future. Next slide now, thanks. Thank you, Leslie. So now how can community groups and local environmental advocates like yourselves use this report for the betterment of nature? First of all, by reading it, you can learn about wetland offsetting, the risks involved, and the limited scenarios in which it might be appropriate. And similarly, sharing this report and your own knowledge about wetland offsetting with your local decision makers who might be considering offsetting can help to ensure that they're similarly well informed about the practice. And then equipped with this knowledge, you can be prepared to navigate and respond to offsetting proposals and policies that might come up in your area, requesting that your local decision makers are upholding these 10 criteria to achieve the best possible outcomes for nature. Specifically highlighting examples of the types and policies and practices that you want to see upheld can be especially helpful because it gives a really clear image of what you're asking for. Next slide, please. And now the reason we're bringing all these resources and information to you in this webinar is because your voices are powerful, especially to the ears and minds of your local decision makers. You're the constituents and the community members that they're meant to represent, and your opinions really matter. So I wanted to wrap up here with the quote you can see on the slide, because if we can care enough together, we can make a difference. And I recognize, of course, that that's not going to be easy, but I do believe in the power of local community voices, and we've seen it recently in the recent reversal of the Greenbelt changes. So it is possible with a lot of hard work, which is encouraging to see. Next slide. Thank you. All right, so I just have a little bit left. And the message I really want to end on is that we should all keep caring about our wetlands and doing what we can within our spheres of influence to protect them. So some of the ways you can do this is, again, by sharing these resources with your networks to spread the word, and also reaching out to your local representatives and decision makers. And of course, we have 4 new tip sheets, if you haven't seen them yet, that can help with this if you're not sure where to start. We can circulate the links to those tip sheets as well in the follow-up email. And of course, just continuing to get out there to love and appreciate your local wetlands as well. Next slide. All right, so with that, we have come to the end of our presentation, and I want to thank all of you again for just coming and spending some time with us to